The Lord of the Rings is a franchise that has captivated and influenced the hearts and minds of millions of people across the globe for generations. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the franchise, has created a legendarium that is yet unmatched, even over 70 years after the launch of the first book. Middle-earth is a living, breathing world with its gods and goddesses and various races, each with their own language, culture, and customs, both good and evil. The themes of corruption and rejuvenation are pervasive throughout all the works of Tolkien, which are based on Middle-earth. Today, we're here to discuss a primordial evil that's existed from the beginning of time. This being transcends all notions of evil, as one can argue that he is, in fact, its progenitor in the Tolkien universe. Before the first drop of rainfall fell, or the children of Iluvatar awoke, even before the sun and the moon were created, and the land of Arda was a mere thought, there existed Melkor, the most powerful and mightiest of all the Valar. Yep. We're here to talk about the very first Dark Lord in the Lord of the Rings universe, Melkor, or Morgoth Bauglir, as it come to be known after his fall from grace. We know that Tolkien was heavily inspired by Christianity and the older Nordic pagan religions, and we can see that reflected in the creation myth and the nature of the divinities in his legendarium. Morgoth is often equated to Lucifer, who was considered the brightest of all the angels, but fell from grace after defying his god. Melkor was supposed to be the strongest, wisest, and the most brilliant of all the Ainur. Thinking about what Middle-earth could have been like if he'd not strayed from his path leaves us with a lingering sadness in our hearts. In front of his might, the Dark Lord Sauron, who was considered the chiefest of all evil in Middle-earth during the Second and Third Age, is but a child. So mighty is Morgoth that Sauron, the main antagonist of the Lord of the Rings books, is a mere lieutenant in his menagerie of evil creatures. The Dark Lord waits, even now, chained at the edge of the world within the void, waiting for the end of all days, or Dagor Dagorath, as it's called, when he'll be set free to take part in the final war to end all wars before the judgment of Eru Iluvatar is pronounced upon all. How did this powerful godlike being come to be trapped in this manner, and why wasn't he killed? We'll answer these questions and more in this video as we do a deep dive into the life of the great betrayer Morgoth, from his creation to his incarceration. We'll be talking about every important moment in his life, as the world of Middle-earth as we know it was largely shaped by his actions. And by the end of the video, we hope you'll get a sense of the scope of power and evil that we're dealing with here, and how not even Sauron can compare to him in these matters. So let's strap right in and take a deep dive as we start at the beginning of all things and journey our way through from the beginning of time itself, the first age of Middle-earth. Let's begin. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Origin of Morgoth. To talk about the origin of Morgoth, or Melkor as it was known at the time, we must discuss the creation myth of Tolkien's universe, as one can't be explained without the other. In the beginning, there was the flame imperishable and Eru Iluvatar, and the flame imperishable was within Eru, who is the one true god of the Tolkien universe. The flame was an aspect of his power of creation. He dwells even now in the timeless halls as he watches over Ea, which is the universe and all of his children that inhabit it. He created the Ainur, who were akin to angelic beings and were offsprings of his thought, and for a while each could only understand the part of Iluvatar's mind from which they came. They'd slowly begin coming together as they began to comprehend each other through song, and in doing so the mind of their creator. In The Lord of the Rings, music plays a powerful role as it serves as the most powerful and potent form of magic. Eru is said to have sung the Ainur into existence, and he prepares for them what is known as the music of the Ainur to shape and create the universe. The strongest and most powerful of his Ainur was the being called Melkor. For long, he wandered the void outside the timeless halls in search of the flame imperishable, not knowing that it was within Eru himself. He possessed a deep desire to create creatures and sentient beings of his own outside of the designs of Eru. Thus, when the music of the Ainur finally began, Melkor wove these ideas and thoughts into the song, and so loud and powerful was he that his part of the music began to clash with the intended theme of Iluvatar himself. Though the Ainur were given leave by Eru to weave their thoughts into the great music, Melkor sought to overthrow it. So great was the disturbance in the harmony that in the end it no longer sounded like the beautiful music crafted by Iluvatar. Instead, it was likened to a raging storm. Many Ainur who sang beside him were either thrown off their melody or decided to join his song with theirs, thus ruining the first piece of music of creation. Out of the Ainur who joined his melody were spirits who would later become Sauron and the Balrogs after his fall. Then Iluvatar stopped the music, and it seemed like he smiled smiled and sent forth a new theme for the music, more beautiful and wondrous than the previous one. This music sang of a more beautiful and wonderful world, and the creations that would dwell within it. As the Ainur marveled at the new theme and began singing under the leadership of Manwe Sulumo, who was made the main instrument of this music, Melkor and those now who followed him once again began to raise their voices in discord, and it was more powerful and disharmonious than the last. So great was the disturbance in this new music that many of the Ainur simply grew despondent and dismayed, causing them to stop singing altogether. It was then that Eru Ilúvatar grew wrathful and rebuked his mightiest son in front of all the Ainur. Ilúvatar tells Melkor that he is the source of all music, and all that Melkor does or would do originates from the will of Ilúvatar himself. Melkor was told that no matter what he'd do in order to mock or undo the work of Ilúvatar, he'd only manage to enhance it in new and wonderful ways in the long run. Melkor would feel greatly humiliated upon receiving this admonishment, growing increasingly more frustrated and jealous. Nothing he'd achieve would truly be a product of his own design. He'd hide these feelings at the time, keeping it to himself. Thus, a third theme for the music sprang from Ilúvatar once again. Unlike the first two, it weaved its way around the discordant music. It chose not strife, but to envelop and develop with Melkor's theme, having established that both themes ultimately originated from Eru himself. Within this new music, Ilúvatar shows the Ainur visions of what their music had wrought, along with the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, the Eldar, Elves, and the Edain, men as they'd come to be known. They're also shown the realm of Arda within Ea, the universe created due to the music, where these children would emerge. While the first two themes, if completed as intended, would have resulted in the creation of veritable utopias, due to the nature of the third theme, this world was beautiful and flawed, but held the most potential out of all the creations that might have come to pass. Many of the Ainur would be fascinated by this tiny world within Ea that now stood in a part of the void, but not as a part of it. Melkor would be the first amongst them to express the desire to go into Arda, to shape the world according to the will of Ilúvatar, while secretly coveting it all for himself. There were others who joined Melkor who were less mighty than him but had a purer purpose. They too wished to shape the world, not to dominate it, but instead to prepare it for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar. The caveat to this, however, was that the Ainur who would descend to Arda would no longer be able to return to the timeless halls until all that Ilúvatar had designed for the universe would come to pass. Thus, Melkor, along with his mighty kindred, descended down to Arda, came to be known as the Valar, forever bound to the fate of this world for good or evil. Descent into Arda, the first war of the Valar. After descending into Ea and coming to Arda, Melkor wastes little to no time declaring himself the lord of everything. He works ceaselessly against the Valar, destroying and disrupting anything that they did to shape the world in the vision of Eru Ilúvatar. He destroys the mountains of Aule, poisons the rivers and waters of Ulmo, burns the forests of Yavanna, and chokes out the light of Varda's stars. Thus, despite their best efforts, Arda is rendered a wasteland, and although the land is shaped, it's done so as a result of their various conflicts. Manwe Sulumo, the brother of Melkor, was selected by his peers to be the leader of the Valar. While not as powerful as Melkor, it was believed that Manwe understood the designs of Ilúvatar the most out of all the Ainur, while being the mightiest of them all and still being rejected as their leader. It further fueled Melkor's hatred for the rest of the Valar. This was the first war between the Valar and Melkor. Such was the undiminished power of Morgoth during those elder days that he alone withstood the might of all the Valar combined and thwarted them. However, he'd not always continue to have it his way, as someone was observing the turmoil in Ea from high above. So it was in their direst moment the Ainur known as Tulkas the Mighty would come down to Arda and aid the Valar against Morgoth. He'd later become the final Valar and would represent the domain of strength, honor, and combat in its purest form. Tulkas would overwhelm Morgoth so severely that he'd flee from Arda and leave it alone for a while. In the outer darkness, his thoughts would be filled with even more malice and hatred for the Valar, and especially Tulkas, whom he feared the most. In the aftermath of the battle, the Valar labored long and hard along with the Maia, who were of the same make as the Valar, but of lesser stature, to right the harm that Melkor had wrought upon Arda. Much of what could have been was lost during those days, as the land had been changed irrevocably, and not all of Melkor's corruption could be undone. Despite this, a great peace settled down over the land. Thus ended the first great battle between Morgoth and the Valar, and so began the springtime of Arda. The Spring of Arda and the Era of the Two Lamps. Due to the arrival of Tulkas the Mighty, Melkor had been successfully vanquished, at least for the time being. The Valar began their great labor of shaping Middle-earth into the vision of beauty that Ilúvatar had revealed to them as they sang the music of the Ainur. As mentioned earlier, not all things that they touched could be saved, as the taint of Melkor had become indelible from Arda due to his power and influence. Regardless, this period was a time of peace when many wonderful things were created, from mountains and seas to valleys and oceans, as Arda finally began taking shape. Out of all the things of wonder to be created during those days were the two lamps of the Valar. The Valar, Yavanna, beseeched her spouse Aule, the Valar of smithing and craftsmanship, to fashion for her two lamps, as there were many things she'd planted that needed light to flourish. Aule would craft these two lamps, which would be filled with the light of Arda and hallowed by Manwë himself before being set on two pillars on either side of the world. We say pillars, which is the word Tolkien uses to describe them himself, but in reality, they were mountain peaks taller than any that would exist in the later ages. There, Iluin, one of the two lamps, would be set upon the pillar known as Helkar in the northern part of Middle-earth, and it would glow with a blue light. Ormal, the other lamp, would be placed on the opposite southern side upon the pillar Helkar, and it would glow with a golden light. Thus, Arda was lit up, and everyone's heart was at peace. The fruits of their labor finally began to pay, as the days for the awakening of the first children of Ilúvatar, the Eldar, or Elves, soon begin approaching. Melkor watched this with contempt as he gathered his forces, which included the Maia, who joined him during the song, as he waited for the opportunity to present itself for his revenge upon Tulkas and the Valar. The center of Arda, where the lights of both the lamps merged, was the most prosperous, as it was filled with Yavanna's vegetation. This is where the Valar initially lived, on the island called Almaden. Manwë Sulamo, in response to their great victory and the wedding of Tulkas and Nessa, decided to give a grand feast in celebration. Melkor was informed by many of his spies regarding this event and used the lapse in the vigilance of the Valar to sneak into the northern region of Arda. There, he raised great mountains called the Iron Mountains and delved deep into them, creating his fortress of Utumno, where he waited patiently for his moment. He'd not have to wait very long, as his opportunity would arrive right after Manwë's feast. After the aforementioned feasts for the wedding of the two Valar, Tulkas would fall asleep, and seeing that his great foe was out of the equation, Morgoth would unleash a surprise attack. He'd destroy the two lamps and cast them on the earth. This would cause untold destruction, as the fires from within the lamp ravaged and scorched the lands of Arda and boiled its seas. The world would be forever marred by this act, with the shape and symmetry of Arda permanently altered from the first design of the Valar. Melkor would escape back to Utumno, as the Valar were too busy keeping the destruction from spreading further. The aftermath of this event would see the world being sundered into three continents: Aman in the west, Middle-earth in the middle, and the Land of the Sun to the far east. The Valar, after witnessing the destruction that their direct clashes would cause on Arda, grew fearful of the world that they would create for the Eldar, and thus retreated to Aman, where they established the blessed realm of Valinor. They were also afraid that if the conflict continued, the children of Ilúvatar would be caught in the middle of it as collateral. Middle-earth during this time was all but abandoned by them, except for the Valar like Orome and Ulmo, who ventured into the Dark Continent to hunt the evil things that were now spreading from the pits of Utumno into the world. Thus, the Spring of Arda and the Era of the Two Lamps came to an end, and Morgoth would be revenged upon the Valar and Tulkas. The rise of Angband and the corruption of the Elves. After Middle-earth had seemingly been abandoned by the Valar so as not to cause further destruction, as they didn't know the exact time when the first children of Ilúvatar would awaken, they'd retreat to Aman to establish Valinor. The Dark Lord would then create the fortress of Angband, which loosely translates to Iron Prison in the Dark Tongue, to act as a fortress against the attack from Valinor. Angband was primarily a subterranean fortress built in the northern part of the Iron Mountains. The command for this fortress was given to Sauron, with whom we're sure you're familiar. In the later days, it had become Morgoth's primary seat of power. All the horrors that dwelt and were created during those dark days of Middle-earth originated from this fortress. It was a foul place of corruption and dark magic. It was around this dark age that the first children of Ilúvatar would awaken by the shores of Lake Cuiviénen in the east. There they dwell in relative peace and harmony under the starlight, which many grew to love for the rest of their lives. The Valar would be oblivious to their awakening, unlike Melkor, whose spies would inform him of this. Filled with jealousy and contempt at seeing such fair creatures, knowing he'd not be able to create anything, even a fraction of their quality, Melkor grew in hatred and sought to corrupt them. He would lure these elves, who were still unfamiliar with the concept of evil, to Utumno and Angband, and there twist and corrupt them to become the first orcs in mockery of the Eru Ilúvatar. In the meantime, the elves Elves would be discovered by the Valar Odome on one of his hunting trips through Middle-earth to destroy the evil creatures of Morgoth. He'd invite them to journey westward towards Aman, where they could flourish and be kept safe from the evils of Morgoth. While most of the Elves agreed and began their great exodus, there were many who had grown too enamored of the stars and soil beneath their feet and refused to leave. There were others who were scared of Odome and the Valar due to lies spread to them by the servants of Morgoth, who viewed the deities as tyrants and refused to leave as well. Some would lose their way on the journey due to being distracted or weary and wouldn't make it to Aman. Many of these elves would be kidnapped, corrupted, and transformed, joining the ranks of the First Orcs. War of Powers and Chaining of Melkor. After learning of the Eldar's awakening and presumably discovering the creation of orcs, which they'd understandably believed to be a blasphemy of the highest degree, the Valar would begin mustering their forces. The objective of the war was to protect the Eldar from the forces of Melkor and punish the fallen Valar for his affront to the Creator and his creations. As predicted by Melkor, a large host led by the Valar would attack them, and the first hammer would fall on the fortress of Angband, which would be utterly razed to the ground. The Valar would, however, make a crucial mistake by not thoroughly searching every deep cavern within the fortress, which housed many of Sauron's most evil creatures, like the Balrogs. In their rush to siege Melkor's primary fortress of Utumno, they'd unwittingly allow much of Morgoth's evil to endure and multiply. After a siege that would last many years, Utumno would finally be breached, and Morgoth would once again be bested by none other than Tulkas in combat. The Valar would then bind him with Anganor, which were mystical chains forged by Aule himself. Defeated, Melkor would be taken to Aman, where he'd be imprisoned in the halls of Mandos. There, he'd remain for 3 ages, or about 3,000 years. During this time, peace and prosperity would reign over Arda, with the Elves finally reaching Aman and becoming High Elves, learning crafts of hand and mind, becoming wise and strong, touched by the light of Valinor. In Middle-earth, most of the remaining Elves would be ruled by Thingol and his wife, the Maia, Melian. In the guarded kingdom of Doriath, the evil servants of Morgoth would lie low, hidden beneath the dark places of the earth during this time. Return of Melkor, the destruction of the 2 trees of Valinor, the corruption of the Noldor, and the theft of the Silmarillion. After the end of 3,000 years, having served his time in prison, Morgoth was brought before his brother Manwë for further judgment. There, he feigned repentance and sought the forgiveness of his brother and the rest of the Valar, promising to work together with them toward their original goal. Manwë couldn't sense the deceit and evil hidden behind the words of Melkor. Having no such negativity within himself and taking the fallen Valar for his word, he set him free. For a time after that, Melkor pretended to have truly reformed himself, aiding the Valar in their mighty tasks and helping the Elves grow as a people. He, however, secretly held a deep disdain and hatred toward the Elves, blaming them for his imprisonment, as the Valar had gone to war to protect them. Further, as was his nature, which had only intensified during his long imprisonment, he grew envious of what the Valar had created in Valinor, which was a paradise on earth. He wished to once again corrupt and destroy everything that they'd worked for, but this time he chose a much more insidious method, having failed in a contest of strength. Among the various Elves he was aiding while pretending to have become a force of good, he found that the Noldor were the most eager to learn and fiery of heart. He therefore began sowing seeds of doubt and malcontent within them towards the Valar. Through carefully curated half-truths mixed with lies, he managed to deceive these Elves and set them on the path of corruption. Melkor first gained their friendship by teaching them about the various laws of craftsmanship and smithing, which the Noldor were highly fond of and talented in. He then began by telling them of the coming of the Edain, or men, who were the second children of Ilúvatar. Melkor told these Elves that the Valar had hidden this truth from them, as they wished the Edain to inherit Middle-earth. He also told them the reason they'd been brought to Aman was to aid in this process, and made them dream about mighty kingdoms with lands they could own and rule in the vast continent of Middle-earth. Soon, a shadow fell over a majority of the Noldor, and they began to stray from the path of the Valar. The most disgruntled of these Noldor was Feanor, who was the eldest son of Finwë, their High King. Ever in search of glory and being great in skill of both hand and mind, the ego and temperament to match, he was the most vocal of the Noldors who spoke out against the Valar. Although Tulkas and Ulmo never really believed that Melkor had reformed, Melkor's deception was so great that they, along with the other Valar, couldn't trace Noldor's discontent back to him. They therefore assumed Feanor as the master of mischief and chastised him regarding his ways. Still, the Valar took no concrete actions against him until the moment when, in his wrath, he threatened his half-brother Fingolfin in the presence of their father. The Valar then finally summoned him to the Ring of Doom to explain his actions. Upon hearing Feanor's testimony, Melkor's deception was laid bare. Tulkas leapt from his seat to pursue his old quarry once again. Melkor, however, was nowhere to be found as he'd fled southward. Around this time, Melkor would appear in secret at Formanos, the abode of Feanor, and would feign friendship with him, offering false sympathy for the Valar's treatment. The elven smith would, however, see right through the deceit of Morgoth, knowing what the Dark Lord truly coveted was not his friendship, but the 3 Silmarillion, which were jewels crafted by Feanor, considered to be the greatest work of craftsmanship to have ever been created. Feanor, other than being the king's son, was the greatest elven smith to ever walk the earth, and the grandfather of Celebrimbor, the one who would forge the Rings of Power later in the Second Age. The chiefest of his works was the Silmarillion, which were jewels within which he'd bound the lights of the 2 trees of Valinor. Feanor would direct words of scorn toward the mightiest being in all of Arda, and slammed the doors to his city on the Valar's face. Humiliated and ever more wrathful, Melkor would depart from Valinor. The silver Telperion and the golden Lorelin were the creation of the Valar Yavanna. The tears of the Valar Nienna watered them. They grew on the hill called Ezalohar, outside the city of Valmar. These 2 trees were the source of light for the Blessed Realm and would wax and wane in turns. They were things of beauty and majesty, radiant energy. After the destruction of the 2 lamps, these were the first sources of light that the Valar created. However, Morgoth's shadow lay over them as well, and things would come to a head 7 years after his departure from Valinor, and after he was rejected by Feanor. Morgoth would return with the primordial creature known as Ungoliant, who represented the Void, which had taken the shape of a giant spider who eternally thirsted for light. Cloaked in darkness by Ungoliant, they would strike when all of Valinor were busy with festivities held by the Valar to symbolize the renewal of their ties with the Noldor, along with Feanor and Fingolfin making peace with each other. Morgoth would strike each tree with a spear, and Ungoliant would sink her fangs in and drain the trees of their sap and life, along with poisoning them. The death of the 2 trees would plunge Aman into darkness, and the celebration would turn into fear and confusion. Using these moments of confusion, Morgoth would swiftly arrive at Formanos, where he'd slay the High King of the Noldor, Finwë, after which he'd break into Feanor's treasury, stealing all within it, including the Silmarillion, before escaping back to Middle-earth. Morgoth gets attacked by Ungoliant and has to be rescued by his Balrogs after his return to Middle-earth. After the 2 thieves cross the treacherous ice bridge of Helcaraxë and arrive at Lamoth, Ungoliant demands the Silmarillion from Morgoth, as they'd been promised to her as part of the deal for helping the Dark Lord in his revenge. Ungoliant, who's believed by many to be the Void manifested into a sentient being, was said to have an insatiable appetite. After draining the light of the 2 trees, its hunger was still not assuaged, since it was as bottomless as the Void it represented. It therefore asked Morgoth for the promised jewels, along with the Silmarillion, which still held the light of the 2 trees. Morgoth, having offered up all of the treasures he'd looted from Feanor's vault to Ungoliant, was unwilling to part with the Silmarillion. Ungoliant, having grown in both size and power after having drank from the divine trees and the well of Varda, would attack Melkor, binding him with her webs of unlight. The screams of agony and pain that escaped Morgoth's lips that day would forever echo in that valley. Hearing his screams, Balrogs hibernating beneath Angband would reawaken and rush to their master's aid, and would drive away Ungoliant with their fiery whips. Melkor would then be escorted back to Angband, which he would convert into his primary fortress. He'd then set the Silmarillions upon his iron crown, which would cause him great pain and forever scar his head. Despite this, he'd wear them at all times, wouldn't risk them leaving his sight. Aftermath of his theft, how he's renamed from Melkor to Morgoth. The news would reach Feanor of the death of his father and the theft of his greatest treasure, the Silmarillion, by Melkor. He'd give Melkor the name Morgoth, meaning the great enemy in Quenya, and this would be the name used by all who stood in opposition to the fallen Valar from there on out. Feanor would fly into a rage, blaming the Valar for calling him to the feast and making him leave his treasure unguarded, believing in his grief that he would have been able to stand up to a Valar. He'd give an impassioned speech to his people in the city of Tirion, but unknowingly, in his grief and anger, he'd utter the lies fed to him by Morgoth. Many of his kindred would be swayed by their new king's words, begin preparing for their exodus to Middle-earth. There, however, was a problem. The distance between Aman and Middle-earth was great, and the Noldor possessed no ships. Building a fleet would take up considerable time, which Feanor didn't want to allow, as he believed that most of the Noldor, who his speech had fired up, would cool off and change their mind to follow him. He'd seek the aid of the Teleri Elves to ferry his kin to Middle-earth, but the Teleri refused him, as their ships were treasures to them, in the same way Noldor treasured things of craft. In anger, Feanor would try to forcibly take the ships away from the Teleri. As elves would kill elves, blood would be spilled upon the holy land of Aman. This would be the first kinslaying done by the elves, and Morgoth's malice had finally borne fruition and tainted even this holiest of lands. Feanor would swear a terrible oath, binding all of his lineages to the fate of the Silmarillion, and those who followed him into Middle-earth would be further subjected to the doom of Mandos, which made it so that all of the Noldor's ventures matters with regard to the Silmarillion would end in tragedy. Thus, a portion of the Noldor elves would follow Feanor and his sons with a larger host that would arrive later under his half-brother, Fingolfin, having been betrayed by Feanor. That is, however, a tale for another day. And if you'd like us to cover the tale of Fingolfin or Feanor, do let us know in the comments, as they are two of the greatest elven lords mightier than even Elrond and Gil-galad. Their arrival to Middle-earth would be brought to the notice of the Dark Lord, and he'd waste no time attacking them, thus starting a series of battles between the two that had come to be collectively known as the Wars of the Jewels. The Wars of the Jewels against Morgoth, a brief retelling. Dagor Nuin Gileath. Hearing of Feanor's arrival to the shores of Middle-earth, Morgoth would waste little to no time in mustering his evil army and sending it toward the Elves. He didn't wish for the Elves to get time to settle down and fortify their settlement. A great host of orcs would descend from Angband to Feanor's encampment in Mithrim. This battle would be known as Dagor Nuin Gileath, which in the common tongue translates to battle under the stars, as the moon and the sun hadn't come into existence just yet. The light of Valinor still shone brightly in the faces of the Noldor. Despite being outnumbered and caught by surprise, they handily defeated Sauron's armies. Feanor, in his anger and hubris, gave chase to the fleeing orcs, believing that he'd be able to take on Morgoth himself. However, upon reaching close to Angband, he and his small company would be beset by Balrogs, who would emerge from the fortress. There, he'd sustain mortal wounds at the hand of Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs. His sons would arrive with a task force and rescue him before he was killed there, but eventually, Feanor would succumb to his injury and die. The lord of the Silmarillion and the second High King of the Noldor would pass into the halls of Mandos as the doom of Mandos would claim its first victim. As he died, Feanor would gaze upon the might of Angband and realize his folly, but even as he passed away, he would bid his sons to continue his fight and avenge him, as he cursed Morgoth thrice. The Second Battle of Beleriand. After the Battle of Dagor Nuin Gileath, Morgoth would send an emissary detailing the terms of surrender for the Noldor. He even promised the Elves a single Silmaril as part of the bargain. The Elves agreed to these terms, but knowing that the words of Morgoth couldn't be trusted, arrived at the meeting place to sign the treaty with a party larger than what was agreed upon. Morgoth, as predicted, showed up with a massive force as well, and unfortunately for the Elves, the Dark Lord's army was far more massive than theirs. They were slaughtered like animals, and their lord, Maedhros, who was Feanor's heir, was taken captive. Morgoth would tell the Elves to leave the northern region of Beleriand, cease their war against him, and forsake the Silmarillion in exchange for Maedhros' life. The Elves, having become even more wary of Morgoth's deceit, would send no reply. Maedhros would then be hung from one of the many cliffs of Thangorodrim by his right hand as punishment. Thus, the Second Battle of Beleriand would end. Dagor Aglareb. Not long after the Battle of Dagor Nuin Gileath and the capture of Maedhros, Fingolfin arrived at Middle-earth after crossing the treacherous Helcaraxes after having suffered many losses to his party. Those who followed Fingolfin held little love for Feanor and their sons for their betrayal. Without the presence of Maedhros and the recent losses still fresh on their minds, the Noldors were on the brink of a civil war. Fingon, who was Fingolfin's son, would, however, set out on a quest to rescue his cousin Maedhros, since the two had been close to each other before Feanor's betrayal. As the sun and the moon had just been created, all evil things were still fearful of their light. Using this as an advantage, Fingon would arrive at Thangorodrim pretty much unopposed. There, he'd see the mighty fortress of Angband and sing out to his cousin, hoping for an answer. Maedhros would hear Fingon singing and would answer back in song, which would help Fingon locate his cousin. Seeing no possible way to climb the sheer cliffs of Thangorodrim to even it and to rescue, Maedhros would beg his cousin to end his suffering. Fingon, with a heavy heart, would draw his bow, praying to Manwë to hasten his arrow and help it find its mark so that Maedhros' end would be quick and painless. Thorondor, the lord of the great eagles who were heralds of Manwë, would answer his prayers and stay his hand. He would bear Fingon to the cliff, but no craft that he possessed was able to free the right hand of Maedhros, which was bound by a seemingly unbreakable steel that they were not familiar with. Fingon would then amputate Maedhros' arm from right above the wrist, and the two would escape with the aid of Thorondor. Upon arriving at Mithrim and seeing the schism in their people, Maedhros would relinquish all his right of kingship to his uncle Fingolfin in gratitude for being rescued despite his father's betrayal. The right of kingship was, in any case, Fingolfin's, as he was still Finwë's son, just like Feanor. The other sons of Feanor would oppose this decision, but Maedhros would stand his ground, and eventually they'd reluctantly make their peace with it. Now, with the Noldor finally united once again under a mighty king, the Elves would rapidly begin to expand and grow. Eventually, the forces of Morgoth would overcome their fear of the moon and the sun, and the Dark Lord would once again attempt to test the might of the Eldar. To do so, he'd send two small contingent of orcs from Angband. One of these armies would head to the west to towards the mouth of Sirion, while the other would venture east towards Miglor's Pass. These armies were meant to serve as decoys, with the bulk of Morgoth's army marching towards Dorthonion. The Elves would, however, prove to have grown mightier than Morgoth anticipated, and the two smaller forces in the west and east would be destroyed by the smaller elven kingdoms and their lords, including Círdan. The main orc army that had marched towards Dorthonion would be held up by the two brothers of Galadriel, Angrod and Egnor. There, Fingolfin would arrive from the western flank of the orc army, while Maedhros would strike from the eastern flank. The orcs would be enveloped and utterly destroyed. The Noldors would give chase and slaughter all the orcs within sight of the gates of Angband. Mighty victory would be won that day against the great enemy. Thus, the battle known as Dagor Aglareb, which meant glorious battle in the elven tongue, came to an end. This was the third battle in the War of the Jewels. Siege of Angband and the coming of the Glaurung, the father of dragons. As a result of the Dagor Aglareb, the Elves decided to contain the evil of Morgoth within Angband, as the fortress itself was unassailable with any crafts that they'd had in their possession at the time. They created an encirclement around the Iron Mountain, laid ever-vigilant watch over it. Although it was termed a siege, the Elves initiated no major offensive against Angband due to the reasons mentioned earlier. During this 400 years of watchful peace, the Eldar and the Edain had grown great, as their kingdoms hadn't been so idyllic and prosperous since their days in Valinor. So great indeed was their growth that Fingolfin the High King even toyed with the idea of launching a full-scale assault upon Angband. This would never come to fruition, as the other elven lords were content with how things were finally shaping up and feared disrupting the status quo for a battle in which, even if they emerged victorious, it would come with a terrible price. The Dark Lord would continue to send out occasional sorties of orcs to test the elven defenses, which would be slaughtered by the elves. This, along with the length of seeming inactivity on the part of Morgoth, gave the elves a false sense of security and power. Unknown to them, they had in fact afforded Morgoth 400 years of undisturbed time to breed his legions of orcs and evil creatures, while also creating a new evil creature. If Dagor Aglareb had taught Morgoth anything, it was that the children of Ilúvatar wouldn't be defeated by armies of mere orcs, and that he needed to devise greater and fouler things if he were to have a chance. Around 200 years into the siege, Morgoth's secret weapon that he'd been working on would reveal itself against its master's wishes. Glaurung, the first of the fire drakes and the father of dragons, would issue forth from Angband. He'd win small victories by driving the elves back to Ered Wethrin and Dorthonion, but would be humbled by Fingon and the elven archers, who would severely injure him. Glaurung would flee back to Angband, where he'd not remain for the next 200 years. Although slightly pushed back, the siege of Angband would be renewed, with the elves growing further in confidence after having pushed back what they correctly perceived to be Morgoth's new creation. Unknown to them would be the fact that Glaurung was still not fully grown and possessed less than a tenth of the strength they'd display later on. Great as the elves were in their early days, Morgoth was still a Valar far too powerful beyond their wildest comprehension, and so it was in the year 455 of the First Age that the siege of Angband would be broken, and the battle, known as Dagor Bragollach, or the Battle of Sudden Flame, would commence. Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flames. In the year 455 of the First Age, on a cold, wintry night, what is described as rivers of flames and poisonous fumes spilled out from the gates of Angband and the Iron Mountains. The plains of Ardgallen, which had become lush green during this time, with grasses reaching the gates of Angband, would be scorched by the conflagration, along with any elves and men caught in it. Ardgallen would be rendered a desolate desert where nothing would ever grow again. As the elves fled from this destruction, Morgoth unleashed all that he'd been creating over the last 4 centuries upon them. Glaurung, now fully grown, would be unleashed with Balrogs and armies of orcs from Angband. They would move to the east and the west, slaying all those who had survived the conflagration. Angrod and Egnor, who had previously defended Dorthonion during the Dagor Aglareb, are overwhelmed and killed. Galadriel would have lost yet another brother that day, when the enemy would surround Finrod Felagund, the Lord of Nargothrond, on 3 sides at the Fen of Sedek. But a group of men led by Barihir would emerge from Dorthonion, which had fallen to the enemy, and carve a path for the Elven Lord to retreat. Finrod would give Barihir his ring as a token of friendship between their houses, which would be known as the Ring of Barihir, that would one day pass to one of his descendants, Aragorn, the King of Gondor and Arnor, in the Third Age. While the assault of Morgoth doesn't progress past Dorthonion and Ered Wethrin in West Beleriand, the east would not be so lucky. Glaurung and the orcs would take over the Maegulor's Gap, Himring, and defile the ancient lake Helavorn. The dragon would burn the region of Gelion, and the orcs would venture from the east all the way south to Thargelion, which would all fall to them. The northern region of Beleriand would be completely abandoned by the Eldar and the Edain. No kingdoms of either would arise ever again in that region. Morgoth's victory would have been complete that day, but the Dark Lord had hastened his plans in his hubris, underestimating the might and valor of the elves, not even accounting for the Edain and their courage. If Morgoth had just been a bit more patient and methodical with his assault, his enemies would have been crushed completely. Instead, many, like Finrod and Mithras, the sons of Fëanor, all managed to survive. Thus, the resistance of the free folk would continue, despite suffering a devastating loss. Morgoth fights Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor, in an epic duel. The High King, Fingolfin, hears about the devastation that occurred in the Battle of the Sudden Flames and perceives it to be the beginning of the end for his kind. With righteous fury and despair in his heart for the hurt that Morgoth had wrought on his people, he rides all alone to Angband. He crosses the desolate plains of Anfauglith like a terrible wind, till he stands in front of the dread fortress. There, the mighty king challenges the Dark Lord to single combat. Morgoth, it is said, was hesitant, as despite being a god, he felt fear. But Fingolfin smote 7 times on his door and called him craven. The Dark Lord, afraid to lose face in front of his captains, reluctantly accepted the Elf Lord's challenge and stepped forth from his fortress to engage him in single combat. Morgoth appeared towering above Fingolfin, clad in armor made of midnight, holding his weapon Grond, the hammer of the underworld. In front of him, Fingolfin stood radiant like a star, clad in silver, carrying his legendary sword Ringil and his shield set with blue crystals. The Dark Lord swung his hammer several times at the Elven King, but managed to hit nothing. Every time his hammer fell upon the earth, it created deep pits, and the battlefield was riddled with them. 7 times, Fingolfin struck Morgoth, and the Dark Lord cried in agony as his forces within Angband cowered in fear, hearing their master's screams. However, after a time, Fingolfin began to grow weary. Morgoth smote his shield and drove the king to his knees. 3 times he did this, and all 3 times the mighty Elf King arose in defiance. Weary beyond reckoning, he tripped on the edge of a pit created by Grond and fell into it. Morgoth took this opportunity to step on the High King and crushed him underneath his foot. Even as his life left him, Fingolfin, in one final act, drove his sword into Morgoth's foot and hacked it, and a river of black blood came pouring forth from the wound. The Dark Lord howled in agony, even as Fingolfin, the wisest and most beloved of the Noldor High King, passed away far from his home in Valinor. Morgoth wanted to despoil the corpse of the king, but at that moment, Thorondor, Lord of the Eagles, would swoop down and attack the fallen Valar, wounding his face before grabbing Fingolfin's body and taking him back to his people. It's said that this was the last time Morgoth ever came out to engage in combat during that age. The Dark Lord also never recovered from the wounds inflicted upon him by Fingolfin and Thorondor, and he would thereafter have a limp due to the final wound inflicted by the king, earning him the moniker Morgoth the Lame or Morgoth the One-Legged. Quest of the Silmarillion by Beren and Luthien. 10 years later, in the 446th year of the First Age, 2 unlikely people would set out on a quest to breach Angband. Beren, one of Badahir's descendants, would arrive in the kingdom of Doriath and would fall in love with the king's daughter, Luthien. Thingol, the king of Doriath, would set him on an impossible task to steal a Silmarillion from Morgoth's iron crown and bring it to him in exchange for his daughter's hand. So, Beren and Luthien would set out with Odome's hound Huon to recover the Silmarillion. On their way to Angband, they'd go through several trials and tribulations, including escaping from Sauron's prison. This is a mighty quest, and we'd love to make a video explaining it if you're interested in such a thing. Long story short, they'd managed to breach Angband through stealth, as Luthien would sing a song of such great beauty and magic that all those who witnessed it, including Morgoth himself, would fall into slumber. Beren would then use his knife to pry away a Silmarillion from the crown of the Dark Lord himself, but in his greed to get another, the knife would break and wound the Dark Lord's cheek, making him stir awake from the spell. They'd make a dash for it to escape Angband as the fortress and its master, slowly awakened, began to realize what had just transpired. They'd successfully return to Doriath and be wedded, becoming the first of the 3 Eldar and Edain to ever get married. This Silmarillion would never be touched by Morgoth again, but it would cause great suffering and conflict amongst his enemies, as the doom of Mandos lay heavily upon these jewels and those who coveted them. Near Naiath, or Oidiad, or the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Seeing the success of Beren and Luthien, and taking heart in the fact that 2 individuals had managed to recover a Silmarillion where the might of Eldar had failed for centuries, the armies of the Elves began to muster. Mithras would start putting together an alliance that would see all of the free folks of Middle-earth unite to take the fight to Morgoth once more. The alliance, which was known as the Union of Mithras, consisted of 2 armies, one to the east and the other to the west. The Western army comprised the forces of Fingon, the men men led by the Hurin and Huor, along with Gwyndor from Nargothrond. Their forces were also comprised of powerful warriors like Mablung and Beleg Strongbow from Doria. Maithros commands his forces in the west, and there he's joined by Azagal, the lord of the dwarves from Belagost, and his army. Their forces are further bolstered by the Easterling men under the command of their leaders Bor and Uldor. Maithros planned to march to Anfaugleith and draw the main host of Morgoth to him, after which the western forces led by Fingon would sweep around the enemy's flank and rear, crushing them in between like a hammer and an anvil. The western host was further bolstered when unexpected help arrived from the hidden realm of Gondolin, led by their king, Turgon. Things were looking really good for the Union of Maithros when they finally moved out to battle. Now, Morgoth had many spies amongst the elves, from those whom he lured with promises of power and riches to those whom he tortured into submission. The Dark Lord already had a faint idea of what his enemies were planning against him. He therefore sent a small detachment of orcs toward the western army. The army under Fingon in the west was to stay hidden, and under no circumstances were they to attack until Maithros' primary army engaged the enemy in battle. The orcs who came toward the west would, however, provoke and taunt the western forces to bring them out. Long did they endure their taunts and provocations with gritted teeth until they brought forth Gelmir, who was Gwyndor's brother, who had been captured during the Dagor Bragalach. There, in front of his brother and the elven hosts, Gelmir was blinded first, after which his limbs were hacked one by one until only his torso remained as the orcs toyed with his limbless body. Unable to contain his fury any longer, Gwyndor and his followers would charge the orcs, ignoring Fingon's command not to do so. With the situation out of his hands, Fingon and the rest of the western army would charge behind Gwyndor to support him. There, they chased the orcs all the way to the gates of Angband and slay them, and for a moment, in their fury, it looked like they'd be able to storm the dark fortress itself. It is said the craven Morgoth quaked in fear, but his trap had finally sprung. Orcs and all manner of foul creatures ambushed them, emerging from various hidden paths in the Iron Mountains. Gwyndor's company was completely slain, and he was dragged into the pits of Angband, never to be heard from again. Fingon and the rest of the army were caught on all sides by the enemy and were in dire straits. Turgon, who had held back from the charge, would come to their rescue as the tide seemed to be turning slowly in their favor. Maithros would finally arrive at his designated location, only to find the fighting had begun in the north. It was at this moment Morgoth would empty Angband and unleash everything upon the Union. All of his evil creatures, including legions of orcs, Balrogs, dragons, and wolves, would pour forth from the Black Citadel. Even at this moment, the battle could have still been won by the Union, as all they had to do was fight their way toward each other and consolidate their army. But Maithros was betrayed by Uldor, the Easterling. With the eastern host now beset from three sides, they couldn't reach Fingon in time to aid him. Fingon and the Edain, led by Huor and Hurin, would fight bravely, making the enemy pay dearly for every life they took. The Elven King himself would engage Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, in single combat and prove mighty against such a foe. However, he'd be blindsided by an attack from another Balrog who would bind his limbs from behind, allowing Gothmog to smite him with his battle axe. Thus, Fingon, the High King, would die amongst his kin in this battle. With only Turgon now remaining from the great house of Fingolfin, the Edain would urge him to retreat back to his hidden realm. They would quite literally form a human wall along the Fen of Sedek and would guard the Elven King and his host's rear as they retreated. They would fight to the last man, with the two brothers being the only ones left in the end. Huor would then fall to a poisoned arrow, and Hurin would fight till he was buried under a hill of corpses. With his axes finally broken, he would be taken prisoner. The eastern battle fared no better, as Maithros' army had mostly scattered. The brave dwarves of Belagost, with their fearsome iron masks, would engage the dragon Glaurung in combat. The dwarves, being more resistant to heat and fire than the other races, would hew and hack at the dragon, but Glaurung would finally kill their leader, Azagal. As the proud dwarf drew his last breath, he struck the dragon's belly with a dagger, causing a deep wound and making Glaurung flee from the battlefield. Thanks to the valor of the dwarves, the sons of Fëanor would live to fight another day as they'd escaped to the region of Osiriant. The dwarves themselves would pick up their fallen leader and exit the battle, and such was their fury, none dared come in their way. The battle was a resounding victory for Morgoth. Though some of his enemies had survived, he dealt a crippling blow to the free folks of Middle-earth that they would never recover from. The orcs gathered the corpses of all the fallen warriors and piled them into a mound. This mound was so tall that it said it could be seen from a great distance. Thereafter, it was only in this mound that grass and living things grew in the vast wastes of Anfaugleith, and it was called Howd en Nir Naiath, or the Hill of Tears. The Cursing of Hurin and the Fate of His Children. In the aftermath of the battle, Morgoth would come to Hurin and ask him for Gondolin's location. As expected, Hurin would defy the Dark Lord's inquests, and for that he'd be subjected to torture and torment. Still, the Lord of Dolomin wouldn't break, due to which Morgoth would place a terrible curse upon him and his lineage. Thus, the Dark Lord spoke to Hurin.
I am the elder King Melkor, first and mightiest of the Valar, who was before the world and made it. The shadow of my purpose lies upon Arda, and all that is in it bends slowly and surely to my will. But upon all whom you love, my thought shall weigh as a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Whenever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they do shall turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death.
The Dark Lord would then sit him upon a seat on one of the highest peaks of Thangorodrim. From there, he'd be able to see the western lands of Hithlum and far to the south of Beleriand. There, he'd not be able to move and bear witness to all that transpired to him and his kin from up high through Morgoth's eyes and mind. Needless to say, he'd be fed half-truths and lies by Morgoth, which would further torment him and cause much mischief later on when he's finally released by the Dark Lord. During his imprisonment, Morgoth took over all of northern Beleriand and made inroads pretty much unchallenged into southern Beleriand and Hithlum. His evil orcs and fell creatures spread across the land, spreading dread and despair with no one left to challenge them outside of Nargothrond, ruled by Orodreth, Gondolin by Turgon, and Doriath, which was still under Thingol. His son, Thorin Turambar, would become the bane of Morgoth forces during this time, but along with his sister would come under Morgoth's curse. Turin would, unwittingly, slay his friend and mentor Beleg Strongbow, the great elven warrior, mistaking him for an orc. He'd later give ill counsel to Orodreth, the lord of Nargothrond, despite the Valar almost warning to destroy the bridge leading to the city and fortify the seat for an impending attack from Morgoth, instead choosing to meet the enemy in open combat. Nargothrond would be sacked by the dragon Glaurung because of this. Thorin himself would come under the spell of the dragon and would end up marrying his sister. In the end, both his daughter Nainor and son Turin die by committing suicide, having led lives filled with mistakes forced by the curse of Morgoth over their father. This would, however, come at a great cost for the fallen Valar, because Thorin would slay Glaurung before he impaled himself upon his own sword after learning the truth about his wife, sister's identity and fate. With his children dead, Morgoth would finally release Hurin from his imprisonment and let him leave Angband to wherever he desired to go, knowing full well that his curse had not run its course. Hurin would wander around northern Beleriand through his ancestral lands, looking for his kin. From there, he'd go in search of Gondolin, where he'd spent time in his youth and whose king he and his brother had protected during the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Turgon would deny him access to the secret passage to the realm, but would relent, sending eagles to fetch him. However, by that time, Hurin had already moved toward the forests of Brethil. Due to this, Gondolin's general location was revealed to Morgoth, and his shadow had fallen over the hidden city thanks to the curse of Hurin. He would find his wife Morwen at the graves of his children, where they would share a brief moment before she passed away as well. From there, he'd make his way to Nargothrond and slay the dwarf Mim, who had betrayed his son. He would discover the famous necklace Nauglamir, crafted by the finest dwarves and inlaid with jewels from Valinor, and move eastward toward Doriath. Once in Doriath, he would throw the necklace at King Thingol's feet in anger for not taking better care of his son. Thorin had been rescued from Dolomin as a child after Hurin's capture and sent to Thingol to be cared for. There, the young man had been taken in by Thingol and raised as a foster son, but the working of the curse had caused him to leave Doriath, thinking himself to have become a fugitive. Thingol would send the necklace to the dwarves to inlay it with the Silmaril, which was brought to him by Luthien and Beren. However, after completing the work, the dwarves would come to covet the jewelry and murder Thingol, leading to the sack of Menegroth. After his death, his wife, the Maia Melian, would leave Doriath and Middle-earth, removing her enchantment that protected the kingdom. The Oath of Feanor would rear its ugly head once more as the sons of Feanor, hearing about what had transpired in Doriath, would arrive at the Elven kingdom, and thus the second kinslaying of elves would take place for the Silmarillion. However, the fabled jewel would not fall to their hands, as it had already been taken southwards to the havens of Sirion by Thingol's granddaughter, Elfwing. Thus, Doriath, another ancient elven kingdom and a threat to Morgoth, would fall thanks to the evil he'd sowed. Hurin himself, it is said, felt sorry after Melian revealed to him how he'd been deceived by Morgoth and offered the Nauglamir as a gift before departing, casting himself into the Great Sea, having become bereft of all purpose to continue living. The tale of Hurin can be found in the book The Children of Hurin. If you want us to do a deep dive into this topic, let us know in the comments. It's one of the most fascinating and tragic tales in the entire Lord of the Rings franchise. The fall of Gondolin. As we spoke about earlier, the shadow of Morgoth had already fallen upon Gondolin, as its general location was discovered thanks to Hurin's journey. The exact location of the hidden realm that stood like a thorn in Morgoth's side for centuries remained hidden, but not for long, as treachery was afoot in Gondolin, and its days were numbered. To explain the entire history of Gondolin and its fall, which is an epic tale filled with acts of heroism and betrayal, would require an entire video. If you're interested in us recounting this tale in all its glory, please let us know. Once again, for the purpose of this video, we'll keep it short while filling you in regarding all the important bits there is to know. The spies of Morgoth had kept an increased vigil over the area where Gondolin was supposed to be located ever since Hurin journeyed to the region. As fate would have it, they would capture Maeglin, King Turgon's nephew, near the hidden entrance to the city. They would take him to Angband before the Dark Lord, where he'd be tempted with dire consequences if he failed to reveal the hidden location of Gondolin and promise great rewards, including the lordship of the realm, untold powers, and the hand of Idril Turgon's daughter, whom he'd secretly desired. Maeglin's betrayal was further led by his hatred for Tuor, son of Huor, and his love affair with Idril. He would give in and divulge the location of the last bastion of Elves to the Dark Lord, and return to Gondolin to lead the assault from within. In the year 510, as the citizens of Gondolin are celebrating the festival of the Gates of Summer by looking at the sunrise to the east over the mountains that surrounded their city, they are, instead, greeted by the flames of Balrogs and dragons as Morgoth begins his assault on the city from the north. Caught unaware, the city soon falls and is razed to the ground. Many acts of heroism would take place that day. Ecthelion, one of the lords of Gondolin, with his dying breath, would slay Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs, along with Glorfindel, who would slay a Balrog all by himself as well. Maeglin, the greatest tracer of the First Age of Middle-earth, would be slain by Tuor, who battled him on the city's ramparts, casting him from the edge, just like his father had been years ago, to his death. With the last bastion of resistance gone, Morgoth's victory over the Free Folks and his dominion of Middle-earth was all but complete. He had successfully vanquished all of the major elven strongholds, with Doriath, Dorthonion, Nargothrond, and now Gondolin, all in ruin. There were still the sons of Feanor that were still alive, but they possessed little to no threat, as they were busy aiding Morgoth's evil unwittingly by slaying their fellow kin once again in the third elven kinslaying on the hunt for the stolen Silmaril of Bedan and Luthien. Amongst the survivors of the sacking of Gondolin is Eärendil, who would alter the course of the history of Middle-earth in the coming days. The War of Wrath, the end of Morgoth. In the realm of Arvinian, ruled by Tuor and Idril, dwelt most of the refugees that had fled the sacking of Gondolin, Doriath, and other places that had fallen to Morgoth. The Dark Lord paid little heed to them, as they appear to be insignificant remnants, soon to be squashed, compared to the major elven kingdoms he'd successfully toppled. Here, Eärendil would meet Elfwing, and they'd be wed, giving birth to two sons, Elrond and Elros. After surviving the third kinslaying and realizing that there was no other way to stop the evil of Morgoth, they set sail to Valinor. Upon reaching the Undying Lands and setting foot where no mortal had set foot yet, he would beseech the intervention of the Valar against Morgoth and ask for their pardon on behalf of both elves and men. Since Eärendil came from a mixed lineage and asked not favour for himself, but for both children of Ilúvatar, the Valar relented to his request. He and his lineage were given the choice to be either elves or men, and he would choose to be an elf for the sake of his wife. The Valar would raise a great host, including the elves who had remained in Aman, along with Maia like Eonwe, and set sail toward Middle-earth. There, their forces would be pitted against the entire might of Morgoth. The greatest war of the First Age, and arguably of the entire history of Middle-earth, would begin, known as the War of Wrath. For 42 years, Beleriand burns as the two armies clash in battle, with neither giving any quarter. With the forces of good slowly gaining the upper hand, Morgoth, in his desperation, finally releases the greatest and most evil of his creations, the winged fire drakes, or dragons. So far, the dragons of Morgoth had been grounded in nature, and the introduction of these never-before-seen winged terrors threatened to turn the tide of battle once more in the Dark Lord's favour. These dragons of the Elder Days were larger and fiercer, and would make Smaug look like a broodling in front of them. They were led by the dragon, known as Ancalagon the Black, who was so large that it is said he towered over the peaks of Thangorodrim. In this moment of dire need, Eärendil would ride forth on his ship, which had been blessed by the Valar to sail the skies, and along with the eagles led by Thorondor, would fight the dragons. He would slay Ancalagon the Black, and as the dragon fell, its lifeless body would crash upon the peaks of Thangorodrim, breaking them apart. With the threat from the sky gone, thanks to Eärendil, the Valar and their hosts would once again have the advantage. They would defeat what remained of Morgoth's forces and marched upon Angband, where the Dark Lord had fled, sensing his imminent defeat. There, they would find Morgoth huddled up in fear within the deepest cavern of Angband. Weakened and exhausted by the war, Morgoth sues for peace and parley, but instead has his legs hewn from underneath him. Falling on his knees, he's chained once again by Anganor. The mystical chain crashes crafted by Aule. The Silmarillion is taken from him, and his iron crown is beaten into a collar and placed around his neck. He's then taken to the edge of air and thrust through the door of night and into the timeless void to be imprisoned, until the designs of Eru Ilúvatar have all played out and the world comes to an end. Morgoth's enduring legacy and the prophecy of his return. Even though the Dark Lord had been removed from Arda, his influence and legacy upon it could not be erased. The War of the Jewels had finally come to an end with the intervention of the Valar. Even though the war was won, it came at a terrible cost. Once again, just as in the past, wars involving the Valar, the landscape of Arda was forever altered. All of the land west of the Ered Luin and parts of the Blue Mountain would sink under the sea. Thus, the lands where the majority of the events of the First Age took place would be forever lost. Not all of the servants of Morgoth were accounted for, as they'd scatter and hide in the deep places of the earth, with at least one of the Balrogs surviving all the way into the Third Age. It would play a key role in the journey of the Fellowship of the Ring. Thus, Morgoth's influence would extend all the way to the Third Age. Further, his lieutenant Sauron had escaped into the east, and in the coming days would rise up to take his place as the new Dark Lord that would torment the free folk of Middle-earth. The Silmarillion would all be beyond the grasp of mortals, as one of them would be set in the sky by the Valar. Of the remaining Silmarils, Maglor would cast the jewel in his possession into the sea, and Maithros would throw himself, along with his Silmaril, into a fiery pit. Thus, at last, the terrible oath of Fëanor would come to an end. Most of the Elves would return to Aman, while the few who refused the summon, like Elrond, Círdan, and Galadriel, would remain in Middle-earth and become lords of the Eldar, who still dwelt there. The faithful Edain, who aided the Valar in the War of Wrath, would be given a paradise island far to the west, where Elros, Eärendil's son and Elrond's brother, who had chosen the life of a mortal, would be named its first king. This island was none other than the fabled Isle of Númenor. Morgoth's role in this story is far from over, as he's set to return at the end of all days. When the final days of the Arda come, the Dark Lord would escape his prison and enter the world once more, as the forces of good and evil would clash one last time in a battle known as Dagor Dagarath, which in Sindarin means Battle of All Battles. Eru Ilúvatar would then release a new music once more and recreate the world and pronounce his final judgments on all. Exploring the complex personality of Melkor. Melkor, or Morgoth Bauglir, is no caricature villain, even though he holds the comically evil title of the Dark Lord. He's a deeply layered character with many facets to his personality. To understand him, we must start with his origin. All of the Ainur were formed from a part of Eru's will. They were each granted power and knowledge that pertained to the part they originated from. Melkor alone was granted a large amount of knowledge, which was exclusive to him, but also shared in all the gifts given to the rest of his kind. From the very beginning, he was different, and he knew it. This difference granted him insight and knowledge far unavailable to the rest of the Ainur, which led him down the path of discovery and made him desire things that the others simply couldn't even comprehend. His fall from grace, therefore, was inevitable from the start, as his unique status and powers were both a gift and a curse. He was to be the greatest of the Valar. He was meant to be aiding his brothers and sisters in the shaping of the world, as he shared in all their gifts. Instead, like Lucifer from Milton's Paradise Lost, he chose to rule in hell rather than serve in heaven. Perhaps due to being so blessed by his creator, he made him a unique entity. Melkor understood emotions. He felt pride at being the strongest, which blinded him to the purpose of his creation. He sought to overthrow his own creator and rule over Arda, and when he realized the flame imperishable was out of his reach forever, he experienced contempt and jealousy. This led him further into the abyss, making him instead corrupt and taint things into shadows of their former self in mockery of Eru, as he himself couldn't give birth to new creations. The greatest of the Valar, second only to Eru himself, would be laid low after becoming more mortal than he'd realized. Even though Morgoth is as evil as they come, we also feel he ironically represents the aspect of Eru's mind that deals with freedom as well. All of his kindred were bound to the will of Ilúvatar and were obedient servants, incapable of functioning against how Eru had programmed them to be. He refused to be bound by rules on how he should function as a fully sentient being. This led him down a dark path that ended up with him being bound in chains, but he at least tried to break his own shackles that still bound his peers. We're told that Manwë couldn't comprehend the evil and deceit of Melkor when he feigned repentance, as he himself was free from it. This proves our point that the Valar, although capable of emotions, were not privy to all of them, especially of the more darker nature, as it was simply not in their nature. Even Tulkas, whose domain was violence and feats of strength, represented the purer aspects of these things. Out of all the Valar, we're explicitly told that Morgoth alone knew the meaning of fear. Ironically, Morgoth was the closest in nature to the children of Ilúvatar and understood them far better than his compatriots, as he shared their capacity to feel all types of emotions. Perhaps this is what made made it easy for him to manipulate their hearts to do his bidding, willingly or unwillingly. It's unfortunate that he chose this path, because Melkor, as a force of good, would have shaped Arda into a utopia, but it was not to be so. Servants and dark allies of Morgoth. Sauron, which in Sindarin means the abhorrent one, is the primary antagonist of the Lord of the Rings books and movies. He was a lieutenant to Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, who would rise in power after his master's fall. Though he went by many names, he was originally called Mairon, and he was a Maia under the Valar Aule. It's unclear whether he'd already chosen to follow Melkor during the music of the Ainur, or if he decided once they descended to Arda. Regardless, he grew to be the Dark Lord's most powerful servant. During the First Age, he'd kill Finrod Felagund during the quest for the Silmarils. He'd be bested in combat by Huon and would flee for his life after giving up Tolin Gawroth to Luthien and Beren. After that, he'd not appear in the tales of his First Age. After the War of Wrath, he'd beg Eonwë for forgiveness, but the Maia, being unable to pass judgment on one of his orders, commands Sauron to return to Valinor to face the judgment of the Valar. Sauron's fear and pride would overcome him, and he'd escape eastward, laying low until he emerged as the second Dark Lord, following in his master's footsteps. Gothmog and Balrogs. Gothmog was one of the main captains of Morgoth's army. The creature held the unique distinction of having killed 2 High Kings of the Noldor, something not even Sauron could claim to have done. He was the leader of the Balrogs, and the strongest amongst them. The Balrogs were originally Maia, who had joined Morgoth during the discord in the music of the Ainur, or later, after being tempted by him. They're described as spirits of fire that were corrupted and twisted by Melkor into demons of flame and shadow. Through all the wars of the First Age, they proved to be the most fearsome out of all Morgoth's troops, even rescuing the Dark Lord from the clutches of Ungoliant. Their number is mostly unknown, with some believing it to be around 7 to 10, while others claim that they were much more in number. It's unknown how many of them truly survived the War of Wrath, with Dorin's Bane being the only Balrog to show up in the tales of the Third Age. Draugluin. He was the first werewolf created by Morgoth and imbued with an evil spirit. He is said to have ed Carcharoth, the greatest werewolf to ever exist. Draugluin is defeated by Huan during the quest for the Silmarils. He's also thought to be the forefather of all the wolves and wargs in the Third Age. Carcharoth was the greatest werewolf created by Morgoth and was bred for the sole purpose of countering the threat of Huan the Hound. He'd bite off Beden's hand along with the Silmaril when the human would try to use the jewel to slay him. Swallowing the jewel would drive the beast insane as he'd abandon his guard post at the gates of Angband and move southward, slaughtering everything in his way. Eventually, he'd come to the kingdom of Doriath, where, thanks to the power of the Silmaril within him, the girdle of Melian wouldn't be able to affect him, allowing him to enter the protected kingdom. There, he'd engage in combat with the mightiest warrior of that realm, eventually falling in single combat to Huan, but not before mortally wounding the divine beast and Turin. The Silmaril would be recovered from his belly after his death. There were many other allies and servants of Morgoth, like the Orcs, Goliant, Glaurung, and Ancalagon, but we've discussed much of their tale in this video already, and won't be repeating them again to not waste your time. Marvelous verdict. Morgoth is the perfect example of the adage, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. His own perfection became his greatest flaw, which led him to traverse a road of damnation. There hasn't been any villain since his inception within the fantasy genre that matches his complexity, scope, and power levels. Not even Sauron, the more known and popular of the two villains, can compete with him in these terms. He is the fitting antagonist of the First Age of Middle-earth, and greatly contributes to the lore dense and intricately crafted world of J.R.R. Tolkien. We hope with this video we were able to increase your knowledge about one of the most powerful individuals in all of Tolkien's legendarium. We all have a little bit of Morgoth inside, and it's up to us to choose the path we follow. Thus, we've come to the end of our tale regarding Morgoth Bauglir, the first Dark Lord and the wisest and most powerful of all the Ainur. Thank you for sticking with us right to the end of the video. Do let us know if you want more long-format Lord of the Rings videos such as this in the comments. Until we see you in the next video, stay safe and stay marvelous.